Hello everyone, and welcome to our session, Public Views on the Environment. If you've come along the keynote panel, so Nature Uniting a Divided Britain, you'll find that this session links really nicely to some of the discussions that were being had during that panel. I'm really pleased to welcome our guest speaker today. So Mike Clemence has joined us from Ipsos MORI. Mike is the research lead on the Ipsos Global Trends survey series. So we'll be sharing with us some of his fascinating research about public attitudes towards the environment. So thank you so much for joining us, Mike.
That's great. Thanks very much for having me. Fine, in which case I'll get started. I've got some slides inevitably. Let me share those with you now. So yeah, thanks so much everyone for turning up to listen to my session. As Ellie said, my name is Mike. I work for Ipsos MORI. For those of you who don't know, we're a large organization that does lots of survey work. So for a variety of lots of the stuff I'll show you is the result of polls that we've done online, although we use other methodologies such as telephone and face-to-face. And the past year or so, aside from pandemic, obviously the environment has been a real focus for us. So what today is a really good opportunity for me to do is to sort of give you an idea of the shape of public opinion towards the environment at the moment, based on the sort of work that we do, often polling, but also I'll summarize a few dialogue type events that we've done as well, because we also run large scale public dialogue events on the environment and completed one recently for the Royal Society. But over the next half hour or so, hopefully I'll be able to show you what I guess is sort of my take on what all the data we've been collecting is saying about where the public are on the environment, and perhaps more importantly, what they're going to do about it, because I think those two questions are linked, obviously, but perhaps have slightly different answers. And throughout that, I'll use this opportunity, this platform, to run a few polls of my own, thanks with help from Ellie. And then sort of, I think, end up with a little bit of a view in terms of what the public are expecting from the COP conference later this year, in terms of, I guess, what they might see as a good outcome, what they know about it, and maybe give a few things to think about for those heading up to it as well. So yeah, I'll start off first of all by talking a little bit about where British public attitudes are at the moment and what the data is showing us. And I think the data is quite unequivocal in many ways. So we ran a poll quite recently for our political monitor series, which found that 85% of people say they're concerned about climate change. So, more than 8 in 10, and that's increased a lot over the last decade. And a lot of the data I'll show you will show the same pattern of rising concern since sort of 2010, which was quite a low point. So currently 85% of people say that they're very or fairly concerned about climate change. And we have this trend back to 2005, actually. And what's interesting is, if we go back all that way, actually, around 2005, we had about the same proportion of people who are concerned about climate change. So there's been a bit of sort of a U-shaped curve in terms of concern, with around 2010-11 being perhaps a recent low point. So building on that idea of it being a uniting value, which is something that we found elsewhere, the idea that there really is something wrong with the climate and we should do something about it, is something that unites people across different areas and different age brackets as well. And I think that's the important point to bear in mind as well when we think about climate activism and people who are concerned. Often the young get a lot of the attention, but actually what we find in a lot of our polling is that the level of concern is fairly even by age. So that stat on the previous page of 85%, when we break it down across different age groups, as you can see in the bars here, actually the level of concern is quite similar. None of these differences will be significantly different. So what you can say is that there's a high level of concern across different age groups in Britain, from the very young to the very old. I think that's quite an interesting finding, because we tend to think that it's sort of a youth activism idea, but actually there are people who are older and in middle age who are also just as concerned about the environment. And the other thing, obviously, we run a poll called the Issues Index, which is a poll we've run monthly since the 70s, asking people what they think are the biggest issues facing the country. And we've had many different types of issues come up over that time, Brexit, the NHS, and so on. But what we've seen over the past decade, which is the point I made earlier, is a sort of very steady level of rising concern. So back in sort of 2010, when one person in 20 might mention the environment and climate change as being one of the biggest issues facing the country. But from that point up till February 2020, that had slowly begun to rise. So when we got to February of 2020, about 1 in 5 people mentioned it as a concern. And obviously, you know, at that point, we thought it would continue to rise, but events intervened, and there was a big dent for many other issues aside from pandemic diseases through the pandemic. What we've seen is that this level of concern has recovered quickly. And actually, last month, we found 32%, so essentially 1 in 3 people saying that the environment was one of the biggest issues facing Britain. And that was the highest score since effectively we started asking about this question, about this idea in 1989. I think the highest ever score we got was 35%, but you know, this is a historically high level of concern about the environment, and this is on a survey where we don't prompt people, and so this is unprompted concern about the environment. And so, you know, it's a fairly good read that it's top of mind for lots of people at the moment, although of course it was second, I think, behind COVID-19, but certainly, you know, a strong rising level of concern, and that's a pattern that we've seen for quite some time now. And we normally tie that into this idea of values and what people, you know, something a little bit deeper than a survey question, you know, an attitude which takes time to build and can be held for a long period of time. And the global trends work that I work on shows that climate change and concern about the environment is something that lots of people agree on and has been identified as one of the strongest values, as we call it, from our work in 2019. And you can see that from this chart, that Britain specifically has taken quite an interesting route. If you look back to 2013, when we asked people whether or not they think we're heading for environmental disaster, Britons tend to be quite in line with US public opinion, actually. So a bit more of a divisive issue, a bit more of a sort of a two-sided debate going on. But you can see the sort of the turquoise tealy line there sort of has risen quite strongly. And now when we ask in 2021, so we asked this survey 2 months ago, if people think we're headed for environmental disaster, actually we're much more in line with what you might consider the European mainstream. So, you know, close to the level of Germans who are concerned about the environment and a bit further away from the US. So there's been a sort of sea change in how important the climate is to British people. And we've seen a change in that, and that's something which looks set to continue. The other point which I thought was really interesting was the idea of, you know, the fact that people feel the evidence of climate change is now easier to see. So again, we asked this question over the past decade about when people think Britain will start feeling the effects of climate change. And back in 2010, most people, almost half, said that we'd see it in the next 10 years or so. So it's very much seen as an issue for the future. And we hadn't seen any evidence of our changing climate at that point. But obviously since then, this has flipped. And so even by 2014, already more people were saying we're already seeing the effects. But now we're at the point where 3 in 4 people, so 3/4 of people, feel that we're already seeing the effects of climate change, and less than 1/4 say that it's something that will happen into the distant future. And that's quite a sudden turnaround. And this idea of being able to see the impacts is something that I think is growing over time. Because the final thing I wanted to end on in terms of my first section is that, you know, there are lots of people out there, and we asked this question about, you know, whether people feel Earth is close to a tipping point in nature where things might suddenly change or be difficult to control. And we found that, you know, 4 in 5 people agree with that in Britain, and in many other countries around the world. There's a sense of this sort of potential impending disaster coming that many people can see now. And I think that's sort of typifies where Britain is now, that actually when we talk about the climate, almost everyone's agreed that, you know, there really is something wrong and we should really do something about it. But that leads on to my second section, really, which is talking about what people want to do. Because it's all very well, you know, winning the argument, making sure that people agree that we really ought to do something about climate. I think when we look at people's behaviors, there's quite a different story, and there's a lot of different areas where we see people taking different levels of action or none at all, even though they might be concerned. And that's kind of the next section I wanted to cover over here. So obviously I've got a little lines here, but what this chart shows is a survey that we did this year, but also in 2014, asking people what they might do or what changes they might make to their lives in order to limit their own contribution to climate change. And what we see here, obviously, you can see almost immediately that, in many of these cases, the lines are all the same length, which tells us that, sort of people's propensity to take action perhaps hasn't changed quite so much over the last 8 or 9 years. When we think about the fact that the level of proportion of people concerned about the climate has increased by at least 20 percentage points over that time, you don't see 20 percentage point increases in many of these actions and behaviors that people say they'll do to help combat climate change. And therefore, already you're identifying a gap between intention and behavior. And that's obviously something that's very well known in this area as being an issue. So the things I wanted to highlight, first of all, we have seen increases in Britain saying they'll walk, cycle, use public transport instead of driving a car. And people not flying, not replacing flights, or replacing flights with train or bus journeys. How much this is an impact of the pandemic, I think is quite an interesting question. Certainly on the flights one, we've seen a larger proportion of people saying they're willing to not fly, but whether that's because they can't fly or whether that's because they genuinely think they won't fly anymore is an interesting question. But you can see here there's like a rising interest in walking and cycling rather than using polluting forms of transport. But when you look at the very top of this chart, people avoiding products with lots of packaging or avoid make do amend sort of approaches, those have barely changed over the past 7 years or so. The second set then at the bottom, perhaps the ones which require the most active change and areas where we've seen a lot of movement, eating less meat and eating fewer dairy products. There have been some increases here, but again, it's gone up from a quarter to a third. So most people aren't likely to eat less meat, reduce the amount of dairy products they're eating. And that actually hasn't changed very much, especially if you consider how much more alarmed people are now about the climate than they were in 2014. And then the final one, which I wanted to dwell on a little bit in this section, is about saving energy at home. So, installing installation or switching off lights. We've seen a small increase in the proportion of people say they're going to do that. But I think this is an area where there's a lot of political discussion and a lot of activism, where perhaps there is also a great consumer blind spot. So people aren't necessarily joining the dots when it comes to their impact on the environment, particularly around home heating. So we did some work recently for Nationwide Building Society about the future of home. And a lot of that focused on people sort of making their homes fit for the future in terms of energy efficiency. And what we saw, and which sort of reflects the findings I showed earlier in this presentation, is the idea that there's lots of warm sentiment towards making improvements to greening your home. So we found 6 in 10 homeowners in our survey said they were very or fairly interested in making changes to their property to improve its energy efficiency or reduce its carbon emissions. But actually of that group, only 38%, so fewer than 4 in 10 were actually concerned about the level of emissions coming from their home. And actually, when you look at tenants, because obviously not everyone owns their own home, that was the same. So I think 35% of people who rent homes said they were concerned about their household emissions. And when we looked at what renters look for in moving to a new home, the things they were looking for mostly was how much space do I get? What are the appliances like? Those sorts of questions. Where is it? And very few mentioned, I want to know about the environmental impact of the property I'm renting. And so across the housing market and all types of people, whether they're renters or homeowners, there's sort of this big gap on efficiency of home and thinking about the impact of heating water and heating their homes on the UK's carbon footprint, when that's about 1/5 of all UK emissions come from that. There's quite a big black spot in people's minds. And I think this chart, which is some Ofgem research last year, was quite interesting, I thought, as well, because it asked people to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 how big a part they thought different activities play on the UK's contribution to climate change. And you can see sort of on the left-hand side, the ones they thought were the biggest impact of burning coal, oil and gas to produce electricity, and exhaust emissions from trains, planes and automobiles. So obviously people agreed that those are both major sources of carbon and greenhouse gases. But that sort of green line shows quite an interesting story where people were, and that's the line for heating and cooling our homes. And so you can see actually it's seen as a secondary issue, although it is a big emitter and a big source of carbon emissions. People tend to put it as a sort of a second order issue. And so you can see most people chose sort of 3 out of 7. So sort of rating its impact as middling. So again, it reinforces the idea that heating and cooling home isn't something people think about very much, and there's perhaps an area for improvement. And going back to the nationwide research, we sort of applied a behavioral science framework to this problem, and we wanted to understand the sorts of barriers that meant people weren't thinking about upgrading their homes to reduce its emissions. So you can think about factors like motivation, physical issues, whether you know enough. And we asked these outright, and what you find at the very top there, and I think it's quite an interesting one, is this phrase, the costs aren't worth the benefit. So, a quarter of people, for them, the issue was one of motivation, and they felt that the cost, so whether that's the cost, the physical cost, the actual monetary cost, or whether it's the cost and the effort, as you think about the Green Homes Grant and things like that, it's quite difficult, or it was quite difficult to find funding or to complete an application. And then on the other side, then there's the idea of benefit, and what is the benefit I'm getting? And obviously, the idea that if you install solar panels, you'll see the benefit over decades rather than immediately, is one idea. But obviously, that's financial benefit, and there might be other benefits that people can think about. So whether that's feeling like you're doing your bit, or some sort of marker to show that you've taken an environmentally friendly step. I think that's an interesting phrase to think about when thinking out, removing the barriers to greening homes. And the second one then, so actually it's less about not knowing. So the second option, that 18% of people said they wouldn't know how to do it. So, cost and knowledge are the biggest barriers, but actually that motivation element turned out to be the biggest barrier to people taking more action on greening their homes. And it's an interesting thing that the Nationwide have taken forward in thinking about how they can help people with that. And on this final section, I also wanted to think a little bit about the idea of people really being worried about the environment, or whether it's actually crowding out some other concerns. So I think Ellie's going to help here. I've got a poll that I wanted to run. So on the right-hand side of your window, you should be able to see a poll that will appear in a second. And the question is, how worried, if at all, are you about the state of nature today? And you've got a series of options then. They should have appeared now. So I'll give everyone a second to fill it out. I think this idea of nature and the natural environment is a slightly separate issue to climate, obviously very important, biodiversity being one of the main challenges for our time. But I'd be interested to know where this audience comes out, because I'll share with you the UK results for this, because we asked this across about 25 different countries. So I think we've got some votes in. I think we're getting a lot of people saying they're extremely worried. So it's 71% currently, and very worried 23. We've got a first vote for someone who's somewhat worried. And then I voted for don't know, as I have to be impartial in these things. But yes, essentially, I can see here, and we'll do another poll in a second, but this one, this effectively 100% of people are extremely or very worried about the state of nature in Britain. And that differs quite markedly, obviously, from the public, as we'd expect, with 46% of Britons saying that they're extremely or very worried about the state of nature today. And I think what's interesting is actually that puts Britain quite far down the list. So countries perhaps where issues like forest fires and things are more of a concern, up at the top. So Turkey, 8 in 10 people in Turkey say they're very worried about the state of nature today. But even if you look at sort of near comparators like France and Germany, actually Britain is below those countries in terms of concern about nature. And so we now have this very strong public focus on climate change and carbon emissions and fighting climate change. But I think there is always the concern that something else could be lost in the wayside as people focus on one thing only. And I thought it was an interesting result here to see where Britain places in terms of concern about nature, which is somewhat lower than perhaps I would have expected, and definitely much lower than what we've seen in our quick poll here of the audience. Which leads me to my final section. I want to talk a little bit about COP26 and what the public know and think about it so far, which is the next couple of slides. And actually, it's my second question here, so I'll get Ellie to bring up the second poll in a second. But we asked this question to a representative sample of Brits through our political monitor polling, asking people, as part of the UK's international commitment to combat climate change, the government is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 68% by 2030. And then we asked people whether they felt that commitment was not ambitious enough, about right, too ambitious, or not necessary, which I think was a slightly less important option. Ellie, if you're able to bring up the second poll, that would be useful. Is it? I see it's I had to scroll up. I can see it now. So yeah, we'll see what people think about that one. There's a strong initial lead for not ambitious enough, as I perhaps suspected. And the only person who voted to say don't know is me. So okay, well, a few about right, about 14%, but still a very, very strong lead for people saying it's not ambitious enough, which is what I was expecting, perhaps unsurprisingly. But when we asked the public, and I'll reveal that now, there's actually quite a different picture. Oh, so just another creep up. So 4 in 5 people watching this presentation say that the UK's current carbon reduction goals are not ambitious enough. And actually amongst the British public, that figure is 17%. So obviously much lower. We found 42% of people saying that it seemed about right, and actually a quarter of people saying it was too ambitious. So you can see amongst the public, there's quite a spread here actually, and it's a sizable proportion of people thinking that this is moving too fast, which I think is interesting to think about. Again, if we have 85% of people who are worried about the environment, and lots of other people saying they're really concerned about climate change, but still to have a quarter of people thinking these targets are too ambitious suggests an interesting overlap here between concern and the level of action people want to see about the environment. But mostly actually, that 42% of people saying about right is probably something to do with the fact that, at least when this poll was taken, which was in March of this year, people were very unclear about what the plan was effectively. So we found just under 3 in 10 people in Britain agreed that the government had a clear plan in place for tackling climate change. That actually compares quite well to a lot of countries, including France, Canada, the US, where fewer people in those countries thought the government had a clear plan. But still, there's obviously a lot of people who don't think there's a clear plan. And so perhaps many people will just say it seems about right because they're not really sure what's happening. But certainly a lot of scope for people to understand a little bit more about what the plan is that's in place, so they can take a judgment on whether it's ambitious enough or not. And then we also asked them questions about, what sort of things would you support or oppose the UK government doing to address climate change? And on a lot of issues, there's quite a lot of support. So you can see here, for example, that there's majorities in favour of banning imports of goods linked to deforestation, the use of diplomatic influence to get countries to increase their emissions reduction targets. Almost 6 in 10 say Britain should reduce emissions at a faster pace than other countries, as set an example. So this is something we find in quite a lot of our polling. There's a lot of people who want Britain to be a world leader and an example to others. And then this is perhaps an area where, again, that feeling can be used to good effect. And then close to half saying that they want to restrict trade with countries that don't commit to international climate targets and end investments in coal, gas, and oil products abroad. And even on the more contentious issue for some people in Britain about giving financial aid to developing countries, there's still more people supporting doing that to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change and to limit their emissions than opposing it. So over 4 in 10 in both of those cases, with a quarter oppose. But when we ask about sort of domestic issues, what can the UK government do? What would you support them doing domestically to help fight climate change? We see a slightly different picture. So obviously investing more in renewable energy and banning the sale of goods in the UK that are linked to deforestation both attract majority support. But then when we begin to go down the scale, you see some other issues being slightly less supported. So just over 4 in 10 say remove all coal power from the UK, which is interesting, perhaps linked to the fact that they had to switch the coal generators back on again quite recently to keep the lights on during a less windy patch and at high oil prices. So sort of perhaps interesting thoughts around the matrix of energy generation in the country. And then an issue on which currently public opinion is quite split is sort of banning the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles in the UK. Obviously, this statement suggests doing it immediately, which is perhaps why there's equal support and opposition. but there are still lots of issues around electric vehicles, what used to be called range anxiety and lack of plug-in points, which mean that there's a requirement for, I guess, someone laying out the path to getting to electric vehicles to help build public support. And obviously, the final thing is that we obviously doubt other people. So this question was, how willing or unwilling do you think people in Britain will be to do various actions to help tackle climate change? And we can see at the top, there's, we're fairly certain our fellow people will be happy to buy green technology and buy electric cars instead of petrol or diesels. And we're just about convinced that people will cycle, walk, or use public transport more rather than driving. But there are some issues where we feel that people are less likely to be able to make the step, and that includes eating less meat, turning off the heating, and taking fewer flights. And often these can be projections of what people think about themselves. So I think it's interesting to know that we find it hardest that people will give up on international holidays and flying abroad. You'll find it harder to give up on eating meat, or to be colder in the winter, or to have to insulate their homes more. Because that shows that there's sort of a fragmented consensus on some issues perhaps, but on those harder ones which require us to change our lifestyle, still there's slightly less consensus. And so that's kind of everything. I'm going to quickly go through sort of a summary section, I guess, about what happens next and where might public attitudes go next. And I think, where we are now is a really interesting time. And obviously this is a statistic from a survey, but I've done lots of focus groups and qualitative type work that talks about, the fact that many see now as an interesting proof point that things can change, things that we didn't think, we thought were too much hassle, or that we thought were too difficult. We've been able to fix by having that sort of full societal effort. So, lockdown has instructed people, that things can change. So 3/4 of Britons agree that the pandemic has demonstrated how quickly people can change their behavior in a crisis. And I think that's an interesting lesson that we've all learned. And over the last couple of years, we've seen lots of big changes, whether it's Brexit or COVID-19. In a way, there's sort of a feeling that change is coming in Britain. And so there's sort of an openness to changing things that perhaps 5 years ago, a decade ago, we never would have considered. And that's an interesting period that we find ourselves in now. And I was really struck by this chart from The Economist talking about net zero and how the next decade, this decade we're in now, needs to be transformative. So this chart here shows, the net cost of moving to net zero. And over time, clearly it will save money to move to renewable energy. But the point here on the left-hand side of that chart is that a lot of this investment and the biggest outlays are coming over the next few years. So between 2020 and 2030, the vast bulk of investment in electric vehicles, in insulating buildings, in changing industry comes now in order to realize the savings later. So there's a real sense that people are interested in change, but also the change needs to happen now in order to hit those goals later down the line. And that sort of led on to what we did in terms of our Royal Society projects. I mentioned we spoke about the future of rural land use. And I think really the interesting thing that we found was there is a greater need for dialogue. So public awareness is always the first step. And I think, there's been a great job done in terms of getting people to be aware that the environment is a real issue. But when you talk about change, there's sort of the things you need to do is you need to align that with public values. So we need to make sure that things are palatable to people, that they understand where they're coming from and why they're happening, and that aligns with something they agree with already. And the second thing we found, and that's always a tricky one, but one that's really important, is to narrate that positive future. And so we talked a lot about the future of landscape, but what people were looking for was, they didn't want to hear about how terrible it would be, but they wanted to hear, what are the benefits. And often we find in our work on the environment, the idea of co-benefits and what other benefits there are aside from being green is really important. So veganism being a good example, like when you say you be vegan because you can help the environment, that's not as compelling a proposition to lots of people than saying vegan food is healthy and it also helps the environment. And so that, already that you're linking vegan food to a sort of a positive story about how it can make you thinner or it can help you like exercise, and it's also good for the environment. And that's sort of where lots of our research is coming out, as sort of having a positive future, which is green by design, but also focuses on other things that align with people's existing values and aims and aspirations. So I'm going to stop talking in a second and break for some questions. But very quickly to summarize where I've got to, I think, very glibly, most people acknowledge that we have a climate problem. And we're at a point now where, so the idea of climate skepticism is quite minor in Britain. And so, we're working from a basis where most people now agree that there's a problem. Converting that concern into action and the right sorts of actions remains a significant challenge. I've covered some questions that talk about people's intention to do things as well, and obviously actual behavior is both trickier to record and also trickier to enact. But that's the sort of stage we're at now, where it's thinking about how you can change the environment people live in to help them make the right decisions, knowing that they support the basic premise of why these decisions need to be taken. And I think thirdly, the next couple of years are really important, partially because the pandemic has been this proof point that things can change quickly if they have to. And I think people are, there's the potential to transform things, and that could be used for a variety of purposes, including climate change. So the open question then is, what will this moment be used for, and how can it be used to help people live a more environmentally friendly life? And I think that's everything from me. So thank you very much for listening. Ellie, I don't know if there's any questions or anything. I'm happy to answer any in the time we have remaining, but thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant, really insightful. It's excellent to be able to get, a clear understanding of public views, particularly if they're not in line with our own, as we've seen from the polls, quite different in results there, perhaps unsurprisingly. There is one question that's come in the chat from Jen. So she's interested in seeing what extent people think individual behaviour or government or industry action is more important as the message is slowly changing to focus more on the latter. And she was wondering if there's data on this.
Yeah, certainly. There is. It's one of the questions that we ask quite a lot, and I have colleagues who do it a lot, because that sort of question of who's most responsible, who needs to take the lead, is quite an important one. I think often we find that people kind of say all of the above, which obviously is correct, but also is a little bit of a cop-out, I always feel, because then you sort of diffusing responsibility somewhat. I think generally there's a feeling that in Britain, at least, that we all need to do a little bit more. The government does, the business does, the people do. But I think, again, it's sort of, what does that translate into? What does a little bit more look like for government? What does a little bit more look like for business? And what does a little bit more look like for me? I think people always struggle with a little bit. So certainly there's joint responsibility, I think, is the general view in Britain, and that can be different to some other countries, but exactly what to do is, as always, a little bit more amorphous, particularly the polling, obviously, which is ultimately just numbers, and you need to speak to people in a little bit more detail to figure that out.
Thank you. We've had a question actually from Richard on the polls. So he was wondering if you feel the samples are representative, and whether that's changed over the years.
That's a great question. As always, we always try to make sure they're representative. That's the name of the game, really, and it really varies. So obviously, I think, so I showed you, for example, the issues index poll, which was the long green line, was slowly increasing over the last decade. And traditionally, we've done that face to face. So in many ways, you can consider that to be, quite a representative poll, in the sense that there's a chance that you could knock on anyone's door and speak to them. The pandemic has obviously changed things a little bit, as we've had to suspend that type of data collection. And so we fall back on telephone. So actually, we do all of our political polling when we estimate what election is going to be like. We still use telephone, which shows that you can get a fairly good read that way. But increasingly, it's online. And in a country like Britain, most people of most ages are now online, and that's actually been increased over the last year or so due to the pandemic. And so each of these methods has their own representativeness issues, and none of them are perfect. But I think online has certainly become the main way to do it, just as online internet penetration has become near universal in the UK. And also due to the last year and a half that we've had, it's become sort of a necessity, the main way we do our polls. I wouldn't say any of them are perfect, and they all have different drawbacks, but we can manage each of those in different ways we do through weighting and other methods of use.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question here from Gian. Apologies if I have pronounced that incorrectly. Is there the same level of behavioural insight available for actions for nature by the public? So, for example, barriers, motivators.
It's a good question. It would be, yeah, it'd be great, because you did it on homes and heating, which is interesting. We haven't done that on nature. I think the report that we did with the Royal Society was all dialogue based, and so it won't have those numbers. I think it talks a lot about, so those are called living landscapes, and it talks a bit in a more qualitative way about the sort of barriers. So we haven't quite got the same idea, so we can't say, 26% of people say X. But I think, what we found is that generally, I think the idea of cost and benefit is coming out to be sort of the main thing in lots of different areas. So in terms of nature, I think that would be one thing. And the other thing also is, I think what we got from talking to lots of people in online focus groups is that sort of awareness of what nature is like outside of your very immediate area is quite low amongst lots of people. So there's a very different communication challenge there. But you're starting from a basis where people in the east of England don't really know what the landscape's like in the west of England, let alone in Scotland or Wales, aside from a couple of places they've been on holidays. There's a very big knowledge gap there, I think, which might be more important for nature than it is for climate.
Brilliant. We have another question here from Rowan. So do you have any data of how likely people think we are to succeed, perhaps to limit warming to 1.5%?
That's that's a great question. It's that sort of thing where I think, I don't think people would know generally. I think you need to tell them what that would look like in order for them to have an idea. I think you'd be splitting the country into optimists and pessimists, saying, do you think we can do it or not? And probably 50% of people would be, yeah, sure. And 50% of people would say no, but they'd probably say the same about almost anything else, because it sort of reflects whether there's an optimistic or pessimistic bias in their behaviors. It's a very technical discussion ultimately. I don't think we'd necessarily fully be able to paint a picture of what the UK would look like at 0.6 or 0.7 or 0.4 for that matter. So I think, people can be optimistic or pessimistic, and it's sort of, like I said, like a values idea almost. And some people are just optimists by nature, some are just pessimists. So it's almost like you need to tell them how to do it and then ask them how they could do it. But we haven't done that question yet, but it's a really interesting one.
It must be difficult as well to be able to predict that when you've seen such a curve in the graphs as well, that kind of dip in, 2010 that you were chatting about earlier. It must be really difficult to predict what that graph will look like in the future.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's obviously the other question. We're on the up at the moment. Like when we look at, we do generational analysis. So you look at sort of different generations and how their attitudes change over time and what that might mean for the future. But often these things rise and fall. So at the moment in the UK, there's quite a big consensus on taxing and spending more. And you can see that reflected in government policy because it understands perhaps where the public are. But when you think back to 2010, again, we were in a very different picture, and the response to an economic crisis was cutting spending and trying to control spending. And the response now with the same party in power is completely different. I think it reflects where the public are. And so actually, of course, the point is we can look back and see this upward curve. That doesn't mean necessarily that's going to continue or that it might begin to fall. But yes, being able to tell is really tricky.
We've got some more questions coming in. So we've got a few more minutes for questions. So Caroline has asked the question, has Ipsos MORI done any research into what messages will motivate people to choose the green option other than the save the planet one? So you mentioned veganism, but what about other green issues?
I'll have to go back to a colleague, but yes, I think effectively the big idea is co-benefits. And so, plus it's green is kind of the strap line that gets people more interested. You just need to find out what the primary appeal is, and that will differ quite a lot in different areas. So yeah, so veganism and vegan food is a good example. I don't know off the top of my head, but I know that the idea of co-benefits is a really powerful one that our sort of sustainability team are pursuing, and I think we've written quite a lot about that. But it'll be very sectoral in a sense. So it might be that you're talking about chocolate bars, you might be talking about cars. There are different leading benefits to which you can attach sort of the green point, but it will vary a lot. And I'm afraid I can't think of any others right now.
Another question from David. So to what extent do the public see rewilding or nature-based carbon solutions, such as reforestation, nature restoration, to be a key part of decarbonisation? Wondered if you had any statistics on that.
This does relate very strongly. I've mentioned the living landscapes public dialogue that we did with the Royal Society, and that was quite interesting because we did cover a lot of nature-based stuff, and I found the public had an unusual interest in peat bogs when we started talking to them about it. So I think there is the idea that some natural landscapes can help just by being left alone is something that feels like quite a neat way to help solve crises to some people, not to everyone. So we found lots of people very much in favour of extending peat bogs and sort of putting trees in some places, though it depends where you are, and if you live in a rural area and you're used to sheep farming, or people in the community who rely on other uses of land, that can change quite a lot. We haven't done any sort of polling as such, partially because it's such a complicated area. But the idea of nature-based solutions isn't necessarily something that people latch onto automatically, but certainly there's sort of the idea that you might be able to help fight climate change by theoretically doing nothing. So re-wetting peat bogs and so on, returning the land to how it used to be, is something that for some people can be quite appealing, for sure.
Yeah. Another question from Kate. So you asked people about the behaviours they intended to change in the next year. It'd be interesting to see if you also collected data on their motivations for intending to make positive change.
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't think we did in that case. I think that's a really interesting point, because the idea of, as I said, like the values or the motivations that get people to do things are really important, and can be a barrier as much as facilitators. So the chart I had was the idea that they don't know how to go about it, or it's not worth. I don't feel motivated because it doesn't feel like it's worth it to me, is a really big one. So and we find that in quite a lot of areas, the idea that it's not worth, whatever the cost might be, whether it's physical or monetary or something else, it's not worth whatever the benefit is, and that's quite interesting, for sure.
You have, I'm just scanning the chat for any questions. So apologies if I've missed people's questions. There's been some really great discussions going on as well. There's a question from Steve here about audiences. So can you conduct a poll among all of our ministers and MPs to find out what they really think? So wondered if that's something that you look at, sort of targeting different audiences.
Yeah, so we do actually run, Ipsos MORI does run an MP survey. I can't remember if it's annual or biannual, but it's sort of like a survey. You get I think we interview about 100 MPs of the 650 odd that there are, sort of a representative sample per party, to ask about lots of issues. I think that's somewhere. So we have done that. I think obviously one of the things that we see in lots of our polling on the environment is there's what you might call a social grade split. So those in the AVC1 grades, so professional people who work in non-manual trades tend to be more concerned, and that's actually more of an enduring split than age on climate, particularly. So I think if you were, I'd be surprised to find that many MPs who didn't think climate was a massive issue, just because of the types of people they tend to be, interestingly. So we do it, and I have to look back and see what we've asked them about recently, because often it's about things like railways and stuff, but I'm sure there'll be some green questions on it.
Well, thank you so much. So we're going to finish up there, and apologies that I haven't got to all of the questions. There's been so many great questions, so thank you so much for putting them in the chat and the Q&A. So thank you. Just a final thanks for me. Thank you for joining us, and thank you so much, Mike. That was really insightful.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.